Winston Churchill famously suffered serious bouts of depression, and it was he that described it as the black dog, which is depicted here. He wasn't alone, of course. Up to 10% of the population is said to suffer clinical levels of depression at some time or another in their lives. And it is certainly the number one psychiatric condition. And according to the World Health Organization, it is actually the leading health issue of all across the entire world. The symptoms of depression are pretty well known. Deficiency in mood is the most obvious one, but there are a lot of others in a constellation around it. Lack of energy, inability to enjoy life, being pessimistic, lacking self-confidence, lacking concentration, and occasional guilt feelings, usually quite inappropriate. It's unipolar depression is distinguished from bipolar, which is ups and downs of mood. The manic phases, as they used to be called, include euphoria, impulsivity, and flight of ideas, getting often very ambitious ideas that can lead to great industry and occasionally creative contributions. The depressive symptoms are much the same as with unipolar depression. Now, as with diabetes, there's a type 1 and a type 2, and the only difference is the relative strength of the manic phase. That in type 2, you tend to be strongly depressed, but just sort of nipping over the top of the curve in your hypomanic mood, as it's called. Where does depression come from? Well, there's considerable genetic input. The twin studies suggest that close to half of the variation comes from genetics. Now, that could mean either that each case is about half genetic and half environmental, or it might mean that some are entirely genetic and others not at all. It's probably a little bit of both of those things. But clearly, having a first-degree relative who is depressed raises your risk enormously, about 2 or 3 times. If that relative has recurrent depression of very early origin, your risk is elevated to about 4 or 5 times. There is genetic overlap with bipolar disorder and with anxiety, other forms of neuroses. But there's also some degree of genetic separation amongst those syndromes. Occasionally you find identical twins where one is depressed and the other is not. And that's very interesting to the scientists because, of course, they then go to see if they can see something that happened to the depressed twin that did not happen to the other. And that sort of research has shown that various forms of stress, particularly broken personal relationships and broken romantic relationships, seem to be characteristic of the twin that becomes depressed. But of course, it is not at all clear as to the direction of cause and effect. And there is some evidence to show that at least a third of the environmental influence is due to not just to bad luck, but to bad management. People making decisions that get them into trouble. Because, of course, people do find their own environments. They adjust the environment, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The other thing about those identical twin studies, of course, is that we now know that there are such things as epigenetics, which are environmental effects usually occurring very early on, possibly even before birth, possibly even in ancestors, which can alter the expression of certain genes in ways that have very striking effects. For example, you can have one twin who is left-handed, the other an identical twin, but he's right-handed. You can have one twin is straight and the other is gay. Striking effects, almost mirror image effects that are down to epigenetics, and that's a thriving field for the future. When you're looking at gene-environment interactions in the determination of depression, some people have said that the comparison of orchids and dandelions is illuminating. Dandelions will thrive almost anywhere, any environment at all. Orchids do extremely well in ideal conditions, but they will wilt under bad conditions. And the idea is that depression-prone people are genetically predisposed as being sensitive to emotional knockbacks of one sort or another during development. Child abuse, child neglect, unstable relationships, lack of social support are the sorts of things that are likely to be implicated. That's where the researchers tend to look.